The porch swing creaked softly in the cool Sunday air as Margaret glanced through her kitchen window and froze. Across the narrow gravel road, Walter was already sitting in the same weathered chair he occupied every Sunday morning. A paper plate rested on his lap, beside a single cup of black coffee. There was no newspaper, no conversation, no footsteps climbing the porch. Just one man, one chair, and a silence that had become familiar as the old cottonwood trees lining the fence. She had watched that same scene for years. Always at 8. Always alone. Her old golden retriever, Molly, rested her gray muzzle against Margaret's leg while she continued watching. Walter lifted his coffee, stared toward the empty pasture, then quietly bowed his head before taking the first bite of what looked like another plain sandwich. No one deserved to grow old inside that much silence. Everyone in their little Montana valley knew Walter Collins. If a fence collapsed after a storm, he appeared with tools before sunrise. If someone's truck slid into a ditch after the first snowfall, Walter arrived with chains and patient hands. He never accepted payment, never stayed for coffee, and never crossed another person's doorway once the work was finished. "I'm fine," he always answered with a gentle smile whenever someone invited him inside. It was the same answer every single time. Margaret pulled a roasting chicken from the oven and breathed in the smell of rosemary and butter. Cornbread cooled beside a fresh apple pie, its crust still crackling from the heat. She had planned another quiet Sunday for herself, just as she had done since losing her husband years before. But her eyes drifted back to Walter. He was still sitting alone. The chair across from him remained empty. She looked at the extra plates already resting on her table. Perhaps they had been waiting for someone all along. Before she could give herself another reason to stay home, Margaret covered the dishes with clean towels, filled a basket with the warm food, and crossed the gravel road. Walter answered after the second knock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret offered a nervous smile. "I seem to have cooked far more than one person can eat. If you aren't busy, would you come over for Sunday lunch?" Walter opened his mouth with the familiar words already waiting. "No, E." His eyes dropped to the basket. The smell of roasted chicken drifted between them, carrying memories neither of them expected. He hesitated longer than Margaret had ever seen. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he nodded, "I'd be honored." As they walked toward Margaret's little farmhouse together, neither of them noticed the curtains across the road gently move. More than one lonely neighbor had quietly witnessed the invitation that almost never happened. And before that afternoon was over, one simple meal would begin changing far more lives than either of them could possibly imagine. If you ever wonder how a single knock on a door can change a life, stay with me. Behind Walter's gentle smile was a Sunday tradition buried beneath 7 years of heartbreak, and today would be the first time he dared to face it. Walter removed his worn work boots at Margaret's front door before stepping inside, almost as though he were entering a church instead of a farmhouse. The familiar scent of roasted chicken, fresh bread, cinnamon, and coffee wrapped around with a warmth he had not felt in years. His eyes wandered slowly across the dining room. A blue checkered tablecloth covered the table. Wildflowers rested in a mason jar at its center. Sunlight spilled through lace curtains onto polished wooden chairs that looked as if they had been waiting for company. "It smells wonderful," Walter said quietly. Margaret smiled as she hung her apron on the kitchen hook. "That's what I was hoping someone would say." He chuckled under his breath. It surprised both of them. The sound was soft, but it carried something neither had heard from Walter in a very long time. Margaret invited him to sit while she poured sweet tea into heavy glass tumblers. Walter hesitated before choosing the chair opposite hers. His rough hands rested awkwardly on his knees, unsure where they belonged. For years, every Sunday meal had been eaten from a tray balanced on his lap. Sitting across from another person suddenly felt unfamiliar. "You've set quite a table," he said. "My mother always believed Sunday deserved its own kind of respect," Margaret replied, "even if only one person showed up." Walter nodded slowly. My wife used to say something like that. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. It no longer felt uncomfortable. Margaret carved the roasted chicken, while Walter reached for the basket of warm cornbread. He instinctively waited until she served herself before taking his own plate. The small courtesy spoke of decades spent around family tables where kindness had become habit rather than performance. Outside, a meadow lark sang from the fence post. Inside, two lonely people quietly remembered how ordinary happiness used to sound. Their conversation began with simple things. The tomatoes growing behind the barn. The late spring rains. Margaret's aging golden retriever, Molly, who insisted on resting her chin across Walter's boot every few minutes. The old apple tree that refused to stop producing fruit, no matter how harsh the winter became. Walter laughed when Molly sighed dramatically after being denied a second piece of cornbread. I think she's trying to negotiate. Oh, she usually wins, Margaret replied with a grin. For the first time in years, Walter laughed loudly enough that it echoed through the kitchen. Margaret noticed something remarkable. When he smiled, the deep lines around his eyes no longer looked tired. They looked kind. As lunch continued, Walter found himself reaching for stories he hadn't realized he still carried. He spoke about repairing windmills during blizzards, about teaching his son to fish along the Yellowstone River, about the old pickup truck he still refused to replace because his late wife had insisted it would outlive both of them. Margaret listened without interrupting. She never hurried him toward the next subject. Sometimes the greatest kindness is simply allowing another person enough quiet to remember who they once were. When the meal was nearly finished, Margaret carried the warm apple pie to the table. The sweet aroma of cinnamon stopped Walter in mid-sentence. His fork remained suspended above his plate. His eyes stayed fixed on the pie. Margaret noticed a sudden change. Is everything all right? Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked slowly around the little kitchen once more. The flowers, the sunlight, the dishes scattered across the table, the sound of Molly snoring beneath her chair. Then he spoke so softly Margaret almost missed the words. I'd forgotten what family felt like. The room became perfectly still. Margaret lowered herself back into her chair without saying anything. Walter stared into his coffee. When Emily was alive, he began, Sunday wasn't just another day. His voice trembled, though only slightly. Our son and his wife would bring the grandchildren over after church. Somebody was always laughing. Somebody was always asking for another slice of pie. There were muddy boots by the door, toys under the table, too much food on every plate. A faint smile crossed his face. My Emily always baked apple pie. He paused. After she passed, my son found work in Oregon. The grandchildren grew up. Life got busy. He shrugged gently, as though trying to make peace with something that still hurt. The phone calls became monthly, then birthdays, and eventually, mostly Christmas. Margaret reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over his. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say everything would be all right. She simply stayed there. Walter swallowed hard before admitting the truth he had hidden from nearly everyone. For 7 years, I've eaten a sandwich every Sunday. Same chair. Same porch. I suppose after long enough, you stop expecting anyone to knock. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes but refused to let them fall. Because Walter wasn't asking for pity. He was finally trusting someone with his loneliness. Outside, the afternoon breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging beneath the porch roof. Margaret looked at Walter with the gentle certainty that had guided her across the road that morning. She wasn't ready to let this become another memory that disappeared by next Sunday. An idea had already begun quietly growing in her heart. The following Sunday arrived with bright skies and the smell of fresh-cut hay drifting across the valley. Before Margaret could finish arranging the plates, Walter appeared at her gate, carrying a paper sack. "I figured one pie wasn't enough for two stubborn people," he said, lifting the bag. "So I baked one." Margaret laughed. "You bake?" "I used to." Inside the sack rested an apple pie that wasn't nearly as pretty as Margaret's, but the uneven crust carried something far more important. Walter had not baked one since Emily's last Sunday in that kitchen 7 years earlier. They worked side by side with an ease that surprised them both. Margaret kneaded bread, while Walter peeled apples. Neither tried to impress the other. They simply shared the quiet rhythm of two people discovering that companionship didn't have to be complicated. When lunch was ready, Margaret poured coffee onto the porch. "I have a question," she said. Walter looked up. "What is it?" She smiled carefully. "Would you come back next Sunday?" Walter looked toward his own empty house across the road, the familiar porch, the lonely chair, the silent windows. Then he looked back at Margaret. "If it wouldn't be any trouble, it would be a pleasure." He smiled. This time it came naturally. And so a tradition quietly began. Every Sunday, Walter crossed a gravel road carrying something in his hands. Sometimes it was fresh vegetables from his garden, sometimes homemade jam, sometimes nothing more than a bundle of wildflowers he claimed had been growing in the wrong place. Margaret always pretended to believe him. Soon they cooked together instead of for each other. Walter seasoned the roast. Margaret baked cornbread. They argued playfully over whether gravy should be thicker. Molly faithfully waited beneath the table, convinced every disagreement might end with food falling to the floor. The farmhouse, once quiet except for the ticking kitchen clock, slowly filled with laughter. Across the valley, people noticed. Mrs. Jenkins from 3 houses down happened to stop by one Sunday with extra peaches. "I thought you two might use these." The next week she returned with her widowed brother. A young couple from the neighboring ranch arrived carrying homemade biscuits. An elderly veteran whose wife had passed away the previous winter accepted Margaret's invitation after insisting he would only stay 10 minutes. He remained until sunset. No one announced that a tradition had begun. It simply happened. Every Sunday, another chair appeared around the long wooden table. Children who had been riding bicycles nearby wandered into the yard after smelling pie cooling on the windowsill. Parents apologized. Margaret waved them inside. "There's always room for one more." Walter watched those words come true week after week. The empty chairs disappeared. The silence disappeared. Even the old farmhouse seemed to breathe differently. One afternoon, while helping a little boy build a birdhouse behind the barn, Walter realized something. He was making plans again. For years, he had repaired only what absolutely needed fixing. Now he found himself sanding an old picnic table, painting porch rails, straightening flower beds. Not because they were broken, because people were coming. Margaret noticed another change. One evening, she heard music drifting through the open kitchen window. Following the sound, she found Walter sitting on his porch with an old violin resting beneath his chin. "I didn't know you played." "I haven't, in years." "Why did you stop?" He looked toward the fading sunset. "Emily always sang while I played. After she died, I couldn't finish a single song." Margaret sat beside him without speaking. After a long pause, she asked softly, "What was her favorite?" Walter adjusted the bow. "Amazing Grace." His first notes trembled. The second verse steadied. By the time he reached the end, Margaret quietly joined him, singing with a gentle voice weathered by time, but filled with warmth. Neither tried to replace the memories they had lost. They simply made room beside them for something new. As summer settled over the valley, Walter laughed more often than anyone could remember. He told old ranch stories to neighborhood children. He taught teenagers how to repair broken fence posts. He even began ending every Sunday meal with one terrible joke that made the children groan, and the adults laugh anyway. "You're getting predictable," Margaret teased. "I've been predictable my whole life." "Not this version of you." Walter looked around the yard. Children chased Molly across the grass. Neighbors stacked empty plates near the porch. Someone started another pot of coffee without being asked. The sight settled quietly into his heart. "I almost forgot people could live like this." Margaret answered with a gentle smile. "Sometimes all a tradition needs is one person willing to start it." Walter lowered his eyes. "I nearly spent the rest of my life believing no one needed me after Emily was gone." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I don't think that's ever been true." He didn't pull away. For a long moment, neither of them noticed the pickup truck slowing almost to a stop at the far end of the road. The driver watched the gathering through the windshield. Children laughing. Neighbors talking. Walter smiling with a paper plate in one hand. The truck remained there only a few seconds before driving away again. Walter never saw it, but Margaret did. She couldn't read the driver's face from that distance. She only knew one thing. Someone from Walter's past had just witnessed a life he had slowly begun rebuilding, and before long, that unexpected visitor would pull old wounds back into the light. The pickup returned the following Sunday. This time it didn't stop at the end of the road. It rolled slowly into Margaret's driveway just as children were racing across the yard with paper kites Walter had helped them build that morning. Walter looked up from the grill. For a second, he didn't recognize the man climbing out. Then the years disappeared. "Daniel." His son stopped a few steps away. Neither of them moved. Neither of them knew who should speak first. The yard, so full of laughter only moments before, grew respectfully quiet. Margaret quietly carried another pitcher of iced tea onto the table, giving the two men the space they needed without leaving them alone. Daniel finally broke the silence. "I drove by last week." Walter nodded. "I figured." "I almost stopped." "I know." Daniel glanced around the yard. Children chased Molly through the grass. Neighbors laughed while passing bowls of potato salad from one end of the long table to the other. Someone tuned an old guitar beneath the maple tree. The sight didn't match the father he thought he knew anymore. "I've never seen your house like this," Daniel admitted. Walter smiled softly. "Neither have I." Margaret welcomed Daniel with the same gentle warmth she offered everyone. "You've come a long way. At least let me feed you before you head anywhere else." Daniel accepted, though uncertainty still lingered across his face. During lunch, he watched his father carefully. Walter laughed at children's jokes. He teased Mr. Jenkins about burning the corn again. He carried plates for elderly neighbors before serving himself. The loneliness Daniel had remembered was gone. Something else had taken its place. When the meal ended, Daniel quietly asked Walter if they could walk for a while. The two men wandered toward the old fence overlooking the pasture where Walter had once taught him to ride horses. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel sighed. "Dad, I need to ask you something." Walter waited. "I saw the way Margaret looks at you." He nodded, and Daniel lowered his eyes. "I didn't know how to feel." Walter understood before another word was spoken. "You thought someone was replacing your mother." Daniel's silence answered for him. "I felt guilty," he admitted. "Guilty that I wasn't here. Guilty that someone else was." Walter leaned both hands against the weathered fence. "No one replaces your mother. No one ever could. The breeze carried a scent of wild sage across the pasture. Walter smiled toward the distant mountains. I still talk to her. Sometimes when I'm fixing the barn. Sometimes when I'm drinking coffee on Sunday mornings. I still miss her every day. Daniel swallowed hard. Then, why? Walter looked back toward Margaret's farmhouse. She was laughing as little Emma from next door proudly showed her a crooked loaf of homemade bread. Walter's eyes softened. Because your mother taught me how to love people. Margaret reminded me I didn't have to stop. Daniel felt tears gathering before he realized they were there. Walter placed one hand gently on his son's shoulder. Your mother gave me 40 years of happiness. Margaret never tried to take those years away. She simply helped me survive the years that came afterward. For the first time since arriving, Daniel smiled. I think Mom would have liked her. Walter laughed quietly. I reckon she'd have insisted Margaret teach her pie recipe. Both men laughed together. It sounded unfamiliar. It also sounded overdue. When they returned to the yard, Daniel walked straight toward Margaret. I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. For what? I thought. He hesitated. I thought you were trying to replace someone who can't be replaced. Margaret shook her head before he could continue. Oh, goodness, no. She smiled gently. I've loved someone enough to know that isn't possible. She looked toward Walter. I never wanted to erase his memories. I only hoped he wouldn't have to eat alone. Daniel's composure finally broke. He wrapped his arms around Margaret. Thank you. For giving my father back. Margaret hugged him as though he had always belonged there. Walter quietly turned away, pretending to check the barbecue, so no one would notice him wiping his eyes. The weeks that followed brought another quiet miracle. Daniel returned the next Sunday. Then the Sunday after that. Soon he arrived with his wife. Not long afterward, 2 energetic grandchildren burst from the truck before it had even stopped moving. Grandpa. Walter barely had time to kneel before both children crashed into his arms. The yard erupted with laughter. Margaret stood on the porch, holding another tray of warm cornbread. One little girl looked up at her. Grandma Margaret. The words slipped out naturally. No one had suggested them. The child simply spoke from her heart. Margaret covered her mouth. She had expected many things in this season of life. She had never expected that. Walter gently reached for her hand beneath the table. She squeezed it once. Neither needed to speak. Around them, the long Sunday table had grown larger than anyone could have imagined a year earlier. There were children asking for seconds, neighbors sharing recipes, old friends making new ones. And at the center of it all sat a man who had once believed his life had ended with silence. Now the silence had been replaced by voices that would carry far beyond this little farmhouse. Still one Sunday remained. One anniversary remained. And Walter had been quietly planning something Margaret knew nothing about. A full year passed almost without anyone noticing. What had begun as one nervous invitation across a gravel road had become the most cherished Sunday tradition in the valley. By early afternoon, Margaret's farmhouse was alive with voices. A long wooden table stretched from the porch into the shade of the old maple tree. Fresh wildflowers sat in mason jars between bowls of roasted vegetables, warm cornbread, fried chicken, homemade preserves, and more apple pies than anyone could possibly finish. Children darted across the yard, chasing Molly's newest, much younger canine companion. Neighbors laughed over stories they had already told a dozen times. Someone tuned Walter's violin while another poured sweet tea into waiting glasses. The empty chair that had once faced Walter on his lonely porch had been replaced by dozens of occupied ones. As everyone settled for the meal, Daniel stood beside his father. I counted. Walter raised an eyebrow. Counted what? There are 43 people here today. Walter slowly looked from one smiling face to another. Just 1 year earlier, he would have counted only himself. After lunch, Daniel tapped his spoon gently against a glass. I think someone has something he'd like to say. Laughter and applause rose around the table. Walter stood, suddenly looking far more nervous than he ever had while facing a blizzard or repairing a broken roof. Public speaking had never been his gift. He cleared his throat. I've spent most of my life believing a man ought to keep his feelings to himself. A few knowing chuckles drifted through the crowd. I suppose I'm about to break my own rule. His eyes searched until they found Margaret sitting quietly at the other end of the table. She smiled with the same gentle kindness she had worn the day she first crossed the road carrying a basket of food. Walter lifted his glass. 1 year ago, that you knocked on my door. I thought you were simply inviting me to lunch. The gathering fell completely silent. Walter continued. I had already decided that loneliness was just part of growing old. I believe my happiest days have been buried beside my wife. He paused, collecting himself. I was wrong. He looked directly at Margaret. You probably didn't realize it that afternoon. But you weren't inviting me to a meal. You were inviting me back to life. Margaret lowered her head as tears quietly escaped despite her best effort to hide them. Walter smiled through the emotion in his own voice. You never asked me to forget Emily. You never tried to fill her place. You simply reminded me that love doesn't end. It grows. It makes room. It keeps setting another place at the table. No one spoke. No one needed to. Walter slowly reached across the table. Margaret placed her hand in his. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was warm. The kind that comes from hearts rather than hands. Later that afternoon, while everyone else lingered over coffee and pie, Margaret carried a stack of dishes into the kitchen. Before she could begin washing them, Walter quietly rolled up his sleeves and stepped beside her. I believe these belong to both of us. She laughed. They certainly do. For while they worked in comfortable silence, passing plates through warm soap and clean water exactly as countless married couples had done before them. Outside the open window came the sounds of children laughing. Grandpa, watch this. Grandma Margaret, look. Margaret stopped drying a plate. She listened. The words still felt almost unbelievable. Walter noticed. You all right? She nodded. I just wasn't expecting another chapter. He smiled. Neither was I. As evening settled across the valley, families slowly began making their way home. Daniel hugged his father a little longer than usual. We'll see you next Sunday. You'd better. The grandchildren waved until the truck disappeared beyond the hill. The yard grew quiet again, but it was no longer lonely. Walter and Margaret carried the final 2 rocking chairs onto porch. For a long moment, they simply watched the sun disappear behind the Montana mountains. Walter glanced toward the old chair across the road where he had once spent every Sunday alone. It still sat there. Only now it reminded him how far grace could travel from one simple act of kindness. He turned back toward the laughter still echoing in his memory. Family isn't always the people you're born with, he said softly. Sometimes. That it's the people who knock on your door just before you forget you're still worth loving. Margaret slipped her hand into his. This time neither of them let go. The porch light glowed warmly behind them as the front door remained open to the evening air, just as it had every Sunday for the past year. if this story reminded you that one shared meal can change a life. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and who first made you feel at home. Until next time, may your table always have room for one more chair.